When the boss handed out envelopes, the room filled with quiet smiles until one number shattered the air: $4,000. Everyone else received $14,000. She didn't argue, she didn't even frown. She simply placed the envelope back on the table and turned off her phone. 27 minutes later, the entire robotic line stopped moving. And suddenly, everyone remembered something they had forgotten. The emergency protocol belonged to her. The conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner, the universal perfume of corporate mornings. Outside the glass wall, the robotic assembly line moved with quiet precision, metal arms rising and falling like mechanical dancers who had rehearsed the same choreography 1,000 times. Inside, the team waited. Envelopes lay neatly stacked in front of the boss, each one thin, beige, and mysteriously heavy with expectation. Bonus day. The quiet holiday of every office worker. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone had already imagined the number inside. The boss cleared his throat. "Good quarter," he said, tapping the stack lightly. "Very good quarter." Someone near the window whispered a hopeful laugh. The envelopes began moving around the table, one by one, paper sliding across polished wood, soft, tearing sounds, tiny gasps of relief. $14,000. A few eyebrows lifted. Someone exhaled loudly through their nose. The number traveled invisibly around the table like electricity. 14,000, 14,000 again. Another envelope opened. $14,000. But when the last envelope slid across the table, the room changed temperature. It stopped in front of her. She had been quiet the entire meeting, the kind of quiet that people in offices often overlook. No dramatic gestures, no loud opinions, just steady work, late evenings, precise thinking. She opened the envelope slowly. A single sheet. $4,000. For a moment, the robotic arms outside the glass wall seemed louder than before. Nobody spoke. The boss leaned back in his chair as if the matter had already concluded. "You'll get $4,000, he said casually, almost kindly. "The others get $14,000, different contribution levels." A pause hung in the air. Someone at the far end of the table shifted in their seat, because everyone in that room knew something the boss apparently chose to forget. 3 months earlier, when the new robotic line was installed, the system had nearly failed during testing. The emergency protocol, the one that could stabilize the entire production line during a sudden outage, had been written by exactly one person. Her. But nobody said it. Corporate gravity pulled the room toward silence. She studied the paper again. Not with anger, with curiosity, like a scientist observing an unexpected result in an experiment. Then she did something strange. She placed the envelope back on the table, perfectly aligned with the edge. No speech, no protest. The boss blinked. "You don't want it?" "I didn't say that," she replied calmly. Her voice carried a softness that somehow made the room lean closer. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed briefly in the sterile office light, then she turned it off. Completely. The click of the power button sounded louder than it should have. Across the table, one of the engineers frowned. Because the emergency protocol system, the one designed to protect the robotic line during electrical failures, required a remote authentication signal, and that signal was linked to exactly one device. Her phone. But again, nobody mentioned it. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe nothing would happen. Outside the glass wall, the robotic arms continued their flawless rhythm. Lift, rotate, weld, release. Steel sparks flickered like tiny stars. The boss folded his hands. "Well," he said briskly, "if there are no questions, we'll move on to—" The lights flickered, just once. Everyone looked up, then they stabilized again. Someone laughed nervously. "Power fluctuation," the boss said. "Happens." But through the glass wall, one of the robotic arms hesitated for half a second, just enough to make the chief engineer glance at the control monitor. A small warning symbol blinked, then disappeared. The room relaxed again. But the chief engineer didn't, because he remembered the system architecture very clearly, and there was one detail that suddenly felt Important. The emergency protocol handshake had not activated, which meant that if the system experienced a real power drop, even a brief one, the entire robotic line would freeze, and restarting it wouldn't be simple. His eyes slowly moved toward her empty phone on the table. She sat quietly, hands folded, as if the meeting had already ended. Outside, the machines continued working, for now. But somewhere deep inside the system logs, a silent countdown had already begun, and nobody in the room realized how close they were to discovering what that envelope had really cost them. Some people in the room would understand it very soon. For the next few minutes, the meeting tried to continue as if nothing unusual had happened. The boss opened a presentation on the wall screen. Slides about quarterly performance appeared one after another, graphs climbing upward, bullet points praising efficiency, productivity, innovation. But the room had lost its focus, because every few seconds someone's eyes drifted toward the glass wall, toward the robotic line. The machines were still moving. Lift, rotate, weld, release. Perfect rhythm, almost too perfect. She remained seated at the table, calm, quiet, observing the room with the same neutral expression she had worn when she opened the envelope. No tension, no frustration, just silence. Two engineers exchanged a look. They both remembered the same thing. 3 months ago, the new robotic line had almost collapsed during calibration. The system architecture had been brilliant, incredibly efficient, extremely fast, but also fragile, like a high-performance engine that required precise control. And when the system encountered a sudden voltage drop during testing, every robot froze at once. That was the moment she had stepped in, not dramatically. She simply sat down at her laptop and wrote the emergency stabilization protocol, a short but elegant sequence that would safely lock the system, redistribute power load, and restart the line within seconds. Without it, recovery could take hours. With it, recovery took minutes. But the protocol had one small requirement: authentication, a security measure the company had insisted on after a previous cyber incident. The signal had to come from a registered device, her phone. Across the room, the chief engineer quietly opened the monitoring dashboard on his tablet. The system indicators looked normal: voltage stable, line speed optimal, robotic synchronization perfect. Still, he refreshed the page. A small warning appeared. Authentication channel inactive. He frowned. That channel was supposed to be permanently ready. Just a moment, he muttered, almost to himself. At the head of the table, the boss continued speaking. As you can see, productivity increased by 16% this quarter, which proves that the new robotic line... The lights flickered again, this time longer. The room fell silent. Outside the glass wall, one robotic arm paused mid-motion, just for a fraction of a second. Then it continued. A quiet ripple moved through the engineers at the table. The chief engineer stood up slowly. "That shouldn't happen," he said. The boss waved a dismissive hand. "Minor fluctuation." But the chief engineer was already walking toward the glass wall, eyes locked on the control monitor beside the production line. The dashboard updated, voltage instability detected. Then another line appeared. Emergency protocol authentication pending. His heart dropped slightly, because the system had just requested the stabilization protocol, and it hadn't received authorization. Behind him, chairs creaked as several engineers stood up. The robotic arms slowed. Not dramatically, just enough to feel wrong. A mechanical hesitation entered the rhythm of the line. Lift, pause, rotate, pause, weld. The boss looked annoyed. "Can someone explain what's going on?" The chief engineer didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the tablet now, refreshing the dashboard again and again. The same message blinked calmly at the top of the screen. Emergency protocol awaiting authentication signal. He turned, slowly. His gaze moved across the conference table until it stopped on her. She hadn't moved. Her phone still lay on the table, black screen, powered off. The realization spread across the room like cold air entering through an open window. Someone whispered, "Wait." The boss followed the direction of their eyes. First the phone, then her, his confident posture weakened by a few millimeters. "You can activate it, right?" he asked. Not an order, not yet. A question. She looked at him politely. "I could," she said. Outside the glass wall, the robotic line slowed again, this time longer. Metal arms froze mid-movement. A welding spark flickered and died. The entire assembly hall filled with a strange mechanical silence. One of the engineers whispered the number automatically. 27 minutes. Everyone looked at him. He swallowed. "That's how long we have before the system locks the line completely." The boss stared at the frozen robots. Millions of dollars of equipment, hundreds of employees waiting on production, one fragile protocol standing between delay and disaster, and the authentication key was sitting quietly on the conference table, in front of the person who had just been handed the smallest envelope in the room. The chief engineer finally spoke, his voice calm, precise. "The emergency protocol belongs to her." Silence filled the conference room again, this time heavier, because everyone understood something now. The envelope hadn't been the real decision made that morning, but it had already triggered the consequences, and what happened next would determine who truly understood the value of quiet work. Sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. If this moment surprised you, follow the story and stay with us. The silence in the conference room stretched so thin it almost made a sound. Through the glass wall, the robotic line stood frozen in an unnatural pose. Metal arms suspended mid-movement, welding heads paused inches above steel frames. Sparks that had been dancing seconds earlier were gone. The factory floor looked like a photograph. No motion, no rhythm, just waiting. The chief engineer checked the dashboard again. System lock countdown. 26:14, every second quietly sliding away. He exhaled slowly. "Production has stopped," he said. The boss frowned as if the statement itself were exaggerated. "Stopped?" "Completely." One of the junior engineers hurried toward the window and looked down at the line. Workers below were already gathering near the machines, pointing upward at control panels. The supervisors were speaking into radios. The usual industrial hum had been replaced by the uneasy murmur of people who knew something expensive had just happened. Back in the room, everyone looked at the phone. Still dark. Still silent. The boss straightened his tie. "Well," he said with forced confidence, "let's just turn the system back on." The chief engineer didn't move. "That's not how this line works." A pause. "The emergency protocol has to authorize the restart. Without it, the system locks down to prevent damage." "And how long does that take?" the boss asked. "If the protocol runs," the engineer replied. 2 minutes. Another pause settled over the room. "And if it doesn't?" someone asked quietly. The chief engineer glanced again at the countdown. Hours. Outside the glass wall, the factory supervisors were already checking circuit panels. Someone tried restarting a control terminal. Another worker tapped a sensor housing like a doctor checking a pulse. Nothing responded. The machines waited. At the table, she watched everything with quiet attention. Her posture hadn't changed. Hands folded, shoulders relaxed, the calm center of a storm nobody had expected to arrive today. The boss cleared his throat. "Well," he said, trying to sound practical, "let's activate it then." No one moved, because everyone knew what that sentence actually meant. His eyes shifted toward her. She met his gaze politely. "Yes?" she asked. Another long pause. The boss forced a small laugh. "You can start the protocol." She tilted her head slightly. "Of course I can." He waited. She didn't move. The chief engineer watched the exchange carefully. Years in technical operations had trained him to notice subtle things: tone, timing, hesitation. And right now, the most important system in the building wasn't the robotic line. It was the human one unfolding at the conference table. The boss leaned forward. "Then please do." Her eyes moved briefly to the envelope still resting on the table. $4,000. The paper looked smaller now, almost symbolic. "I'm curious about something," she said gently. The room froze again. The boss blinked. "Yes?" She tapped the envelope lightly with one finger. Earlier you mentioned different contribution levels. The sentence hung there like a mirror being held up to the room. No accusation, just a reflection. Outside the glass wall, a supervisor below waved urgently toward the control booth. The chief engineer's tablet updated again. System lock countdown, 2351. The engineers around the table shifted in their seats, because the reality everyone was quietly calculating was simple. Every minute of downtime on the robotic line cost tens of thousands of dollars. 23 minutes could become millions. The boss rubbed the back of his neck. Well, bonuses are complex decisions. Of course, she said calmly. Her voice remained soft, but something about it now carried weight, the way a small key can open a very large door. She reached toward the phone. The room leaned forward. Her fingers touched it, but instead of turning it on, she simply moved it slightly closer to herself. Another pause. Across the table, the chief engineer finally spoke, not to pressure her, to clarify the situation. For the record, he said evenly, the emergency stabilization system was designed and registered under her credentials. That protocol protects the entire robotic line. The statement landed quietly, but its meaning filled the room. The boss slowly looked around the table. For the first time that morning, the atmosphere had shifted. The confident authority he had walked in with was now balancing on a much thinner surface. He inhaled, then spoke again, this time more carefully. I think, he said, we should revisit the bonus discussion. Nobody smiled, nobody laughed, but the engineers exchanged brief glances that carried something close to relief, because the problem in the room had never truly been the robots. It had been recognition, and recognition, once delayed long enough, has a way of arriving all at once. The boss cleared his throat again. We may have underestimated certain contributions. She didn't respond immediately. Outside the glass wall, the supervisors waited beside silent machines. The countdown continued. 21:08. Finally, she looked at the phone again, then back at the boss. A faint hint of irony touched her voice, not cruel, not mocking, just precise. Interesting, she said, because the system never underestimated them. Several people at the table quietly exhaled. The chief engineer almost smiled. And somewhere below the conference room, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of idle machinery continued to wait for a signal that only one person in the room could provide. What happened next would redefine more than just a bonus. The seconds continued to fall from the countdown like quiet drops of water. 2031. Nobody in the conference room was looking at the presentation screen anymore. The graphs and charts had become irrelevant decorations, relics from a meeting that now felt like it had happened hours ago. Outside the glass wall, the factory floor had fully awakened to the problem. Supervisors walked quickly between the machines. Radios crackled. A technician opened an electrical cabinet and immediately closed it again when he realized the issue wasn't there. The robotic arms remained suspended like statues, perfect machines, waiting for a human decision. Back in the room, the boss leaned back in his chair, trying to recover the tone of authority he had used earlier that morning. But authority is a fragile thing when reality begins to contradict it. He folded his hands. Well, he said carefully, perhaps we moved too quickly with the bonuses. Across the table, one of the engineers quietly nodded, not openly agreeing, but acknowledging the obvious. She didn't respond. She simply observed. The same calm attention she had given to system architecture now studied the dynamics of the room, the shifting tone, the sudden humility in voices that had sounded so certain earlier. The chief engineer glanced again at his tablet. System lock countdown, 1912. He cleared his throat. For context, he said, addressing the boss but letting the entire room hear it, the emergency stabilization protocol doesn't just restart the line. The boss looked up. It prevents mechanical damage during sudden power loss. He tapped the screen. These robots can't simply resume movement after an uncontrolled stop. Without the protocol, the entire line must be recalibrated manually. How long? The boss asked quietly. The engineer hesitated only slightly. 6 hours at minimum. Several people at the table shifted in their seats. 6 hours. Production delays, shipping deadlines, contract penalties. Outside the glass wall, workers were already standing beside idle stations. The factory floor felt like a giant engine that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. The boss leaned forward again. His tone had changed now, more cautious. "Look," he said, directing the words toward her. "If there was a misunderstanding this morning." She raised one eyebrow slightly. "A misunderstanding? Well, perhaps we underestimated how critical your role is." A soft ripple moved through the room, because the phrase sounded polite, but everyone knew it meant something else. The boss was correcting the earlier statement. Quietly. She considered the envelope again. The thin sheet of paper inside it looked almost absurd now. "Contribution levels," she said thoughtfully. That was the phrase. The boss nodded slowly. "Yes." He paused, then said something he probably had not planned to say when he walked into the meeting that morning. "We may need to revise that assessment." Across the table, the chief engineer leaned back slightly, watching the exchange like someone observing a delicate calibration process. Because this wasn't negotiation, it was recognition catching up with reality. The countdown changed again. 17:46. Outside the window, the supervisors had stopped trying random fixes. Now they were simply waiting. Everyone knew the restart would come from the conference room. The boss exhaled slowly. "Let's correct this." He reached for the envelope she had returned earlier, pulled out the paper, looked at it, then set it aside. "The bonuses were based on outdated evaluations," he said. "We'll adjust them." No numbers yet, but the direction had changed. The engineers exchanged quick glances. For the first time since the lights flickered, the room felt slightly less tense. She rested her hands on the table, not triumphant, not defensive, just patient. "Interesting," she said softly. The boss waited. Because the system evaluation wasn't outdated. He blinked. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the frozen robotic line beyond the glass. "The protocol was designed for exactly this situation." A pause. Unexpected stress reveals the real architecture. The chief engineer nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. Systems and organizations reveal their true structure when something breaks. The boss followed her gaze toward the factory floor. The silent machines suddenly looked very different, not symbols of efficiency, symbols of dependency. He inhaled again, then spoke more directly. "You built the stabilization protocol?" "Yes." "You registered the authentication key?" "Yes." "And without that system?" She finished the sentence for him. "The robots stay frozen." The room remained still. Outside the glass, a supervisor looked up toward the conference room as if he somehow knew the decision was happening there. The boss finally pushed the envelope completely aside. "We will correct the compensation." A longer pause. Then, more honestly, "and the recognition." The chief engineer looked at the countdown. 15:03. He raised his eyes toward her, not asking, simply acknowledging that time still mattered. She looked at the phone again. The small black screen reflected the ceiling lights like a calm pool of water. Then she looked back at the boss. "Recognition," she said thoughtfully. "Yes." He nodded. "Recognition." Another quiet moment passed. Because in offices, recognition rarely arrives dramatically. More often it arrives like this, slowly, reluctantly, but unmistakably. The room waited. The robots waited. The countdown continued. And somewhere between pride, responsibility, and quiet professionalism, a decision was forming. One that would restart more than just a production line. The next moment would show whether the company truly understood what had just happened. The room had grown strangely quiet, not the tense silence from earlier, the kind that follows a shock, but a deeper one. The silence of people realizing that something small had revealed something much larger. The boss no longer looked at the envelope. He was looking at the frozen production line. Rows of motionless robots stretched across the factory floor like paused dominoes, each one built to perform thousands of precise movements per hour, each one waiting for a single signal, and that signal was sitting quietly on the table, in front of her. The chief engineer glanced again at the dashboard. System lock countdown, 12:41. The room inhaled collectively. The boss rubbed his temples slowly. The confident executive posture had softened into something more thoughtful. "I want to correct something," he said finally. His voice no longer carried the casual certainty from earlier that morning. He looked directly at her. "When we reviewed contributions this quarter, we focused on visible metrics." He gestured vaguely toward the presentation screen behind him. "Output, reports, project timelines." She listened, not interrupting. "And sometimes," he continued, "the most critical work is invisible until the moment it becomes essential." Across the table, several engineers nodded slightly. Every technical team knew this truth. Infrastructure work, stability systems, fail-safes, they rarely receive applause until the moment they prevent disaster. The chief engineer folded his arms. "Engineering rule," he said quietly. "The system you forget about is usually the one protecting everything." A faint smile appeared on her face. Not victory, recognition. The boss reached into his folder and pulled out a different document. He slid it across the table. "This is the revised compensation plan for the automation team," he said. She didn't reach for it immediately. The engineers leaned forward slightly. The boss continued. "The emergency stabilization system changed the risk profile of the entire robotic line. Without it, we would never have approved full automation." He paused. "So the evaluation should have reflected that." She finally picked up the paper. Her eyes moved calmly across the lines. Numbers, revised bonus, equity adjustment, a new title attached to the automation program. Around the table, the engineers watched carefully, not because they were interested in the numbers, but because they wanted to see her reaction. She placed the document back on the table. Then she reached for the phone. The room held its breath. For the first time since the meeting began, the phone screen lit up. A quiet glow. No dramatic music, no speeches, just a simple login screen. She entered a short authentication code, then opened a secure application. The chief engineer's tablet immediately refreshed. Emergency protocol authentication detected. A new line appeared. Stabilization sequence initializing. Outside the glass wall, something changed. The robots didn't move yet, but their control lights switched from red to amber. Energy returned to the system like breath returning to lungs. Inside the room, nobody spoke. The stabilization program ran quietly through its steps. Power redistribution, motor calibration, sensor synchronization. The chief engineer watched the dashboard like a pilot watching instruments during landing. Then the final message appeared. Line restart authorized. Outside the window, the first robotic arm slowly lowered its welding head. Another rotated gently. Then the entire production line resumed motion. Lift, rotate, weld, release. The familiar mechanical rhythm returned to the factory floor. Workers below looked up at the machines with relief. Radios crackled again. Production had returned. Inside the conference room, the boss exhaled for what felt like the first time in several minutes. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, not proudly, just professionally. The chief engineer closed the dashboard on his tablet. "System stable," he confirmed. The boss leaned back in his chair again, but this time the posture carried something new. Respect. "You know," he said slowly, "I've spent 20 years in manufacturing." He gestured toward the robotic line beyond the glass. "I thought I understood how these systems worked." She tilted her head slightly. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I understand something better." A pause. "The most important system in a company is the one you almost forget to value." Across the table, the engineers exchanged quiet looks of agreement, because everyone in that room knew the truth now. The robots had frozen for 27 minutes, But the real failure had happened long before the power fluctuation. It happened the moment someone looked at a quiet contributor and assumed the work wasn't critical. The boss slid the revised document closer to her again. "This time," he said, "the contribution levels are correct." She glanced briefly at the page, then closed the application on her phone. Outside the glass wall, the robotic line continued its smooth, mechanical dance. Stronger now, stabilized by a protocol that would likely never be noticed again, which, in engineering, is the highest compliment a system can receive. The conference room slowly relaxed, but one lesson remained clear to everyone present. Sometimes the quietest person at the table is not just part of the system, sometimes they are the reason the system works at all.